A steady drizzle pattered against the windows of the Harrow County Post Office, the kind of rain that softened the edges of the day and dulled the streets to a muted silver. Inside, the scent of paper and ink hung heavy in the air. Behind the counter, Clerk Samuel Ridgway sorted the morning's delivery, circulars, bills, and birthday cards in bright envelopes. It was a ritual so unremarkable that he could almost perform it blindfolded. And then his fingers touched something that made him stop. The envelope was the color of old parchment, its edges softened from age but not torn. The paper was heavier than modern stock, fibrous to the touch, and the faint smell of lavender clung to it, like something lifted from a cedar chest after decades. Samuel turned it over, expecting to see some stamp commemorating a historical event or a bit of kitschy nostalgia. Instead, the stamp was real, pressed, faded, and bearing the mark of a monarch long dead. The postmark was even stranger. It read, October 12, 1915. Not as a retro design or reprint, but with the uneven inking and slight bleed that only the mechanical arms of an early 20th century canceling machine could produce. He felt the weight of it in his palm, heavier than it should have been for a single folded sheet of paper. The address was written in a fine, slanted cursive, the kind of script children no longer learned in school. It was addressed to Miss Abigail M. Rowan, Harrow County, Georgia, with no street number. Just the county name, as if it was assumed the postman would know exactly where to take it. And here was the final impossibility: Abigail Rowan was alive. Not only alive, but she had a mailbox 2 miles from the post office, the same box she had been using for 30 years. And according to every public record, she had been born in 1972, 57 years after this letter was supposedly sent. Samuel hesitated, turning the envelope over again. The return name was written neatly in the top left corner, Eliza Harrow. That name was not one Samuel recognized at first, but the sound of it made him uneasy, as though he had brushed against something he shouldn't. When he glanced up from the envelope, he caught the eye of Mrs. May Carter, who had been standing in line behind a farmer with a stack of feed invoices. Her expression froze when she saw the handwriting. "Lord help us," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else, and stepped quietly out the door without finishing her errand. Samuel slid the envelope into the special delivery tray, though it was not marked for such handling. A feeling settled over him, not fear, exactly, but the sense of holding something that was not entirely meant to be in this time. He placed it gently, as though a rough movement might break the illusion. Within the hour, Abigail Rowan was standing at the counter. She was a tall woman with dark hair streaked silver at the temples, the lines at the corners of her mouth deepened not so much by age as by a lifetime of careful restraint. Samuel handed her the letter without a word, his eyes fixed on her face as she read the return name. Her knuckles whitened around the paper. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It came through this morning," Samuel said. "Stamped in 1915. Abigail's eyes narrowed slightly, but not in disbelief. If anything, her expression was one of recognition, as though she had expected something like this, though not perhaps in such a public way. She pressed the envelope to her chest, glanced once at the rain-speckled window, and then said only, "Thank you." As she turned to leave, Samuel caught a glimpse of her other hand. It trembled faintly. He would later tell his wife that it was not the tremor of an old woman's weakness, but the sort of shake that comes when you are holding something you have waited for all your life, or something you have dreaded. The post office door closed behind her, the bell above it chiming once. Outside, Abigail stepped into the drizzle, the envelope clutched tightly in her grip. The wind lifted the corner of her coat, and for a moment, the world seemed to still, the hiss of rain, the creak of the wooden boardwalk, the soft metallic tick of the old postmark against her palm. Across the street, in the shadow of the old courthouse, Mrs. May Carter watched her go. She was already rehearsing the story she would tell later that afternoon, lowering her voice when she reached the part about the name written in the top left corner, the name that should not have been on any letter, in any year, that arrived in Harrow County in 2025. "If you'd like, I can now move straight into writing the second section so the cinematic flow doesn't break." Would you like me to? Harrow County was the kind of place where time did not move forward so much as circle back on itself, season after season. The same oak trees shaded the courthouse lawn that had been there a century ago, their roots curling under brick pathways laid by men in bowler hats. Even the storefronts still bore the names of families whose bloodlines had been planted in this soil long before the country's borders were settled. There was a stillness to the town, not the kind born of peace, but of habit. At midday, the church bells rang with a tone that had not changed in living memory. The same painted sign swung above Garrison's general store, its lettering faded to the color of old bone. In the evenings, porch lights glowed like amber beads against the dark, each one holding within it the small theater of a family's routine: supper, radio, silence. It was a place that did not forget. Children who once played marbles in the dust eventually took over their father's shops. Old grudges could be passed down like heirlooms. A face glimpsed in an old photograph could still be matched to a grandchild's features decades later. And in Harrow County, the dead were often spoken of as if they had simply stepped into another room, close enough to hear you if you raised your voice. The Rowan family had lived on the same stretch of red clay road since the Reconstruction era. Their home was a weathered, white-painted farmhouse with a front porch that bowed slightly at the center, as though it carried the weight of every conversation ever had upon it. Abigail lived there alone now, though her father had been the county's school principal and her mother had kept a reputation for strict hospitality. You would be fed, but you would also be told exactly what was wrong with your posture. It was not unusual for Harrow County to find itself at the center of small peculiarities, the kind that never made it past the county lines. An unexplained fire that spared a single room in an otherwise charred house. A bell that rang in the church steeple though the rope had been cut years before. Livestock found standing perfectly still at dawn, their breath clouding the cold air in unison. The people who spoke of these things did so quietly, and with a peculiar resignation, as though the land itself occasionally reminded them it had its own will. When word spread about the letter, it did not travel in the excited tone of gossip, but in something closer to the cadence of a warning. The post office was a half-day's errand for most, but by that afternoon, there had been a steady trickle of townsfolk coming in under the pretense of buying stamps or asking after packages. They leaned on the counter, lowering their voices to Samuel Ridgway, asking to see the old envelope for themselves. He did not oblige. At Garrison's, the topic was discussed with careful phrasing, as though too much curiosity might draw unwelcome attention. Some wondered aloud if it might be a hoax, a prop from a historical film production, perhaps. But Harrow County had not seen a camera crew in decades, and certainly not one with such impeccable attention to paper stock and handwriting. Others muttered about Eliza Harrow, in the same tone one might use for a winter illness, an old trouble that sometimes returned without warning. No one could quite recall when the Harrow name had last been spoken openly. It was one of those threads in the county's history that had been pulled tight, then knotted, then pushed quietly to the back of the drawer. But those who had lived here long enough remembered that the Harrows had once been prominent, wealthy landowners with a large estate just beyond the river bend, their home set far back from the road, where the drive was lined with black walnut trees. By the time the estate was torn down in the 1940s, no one from the Harrow line remained in Harrow County. And yet, to the older generation, that name still carried a faint chill, the kind of chill that comes from having seen a door close but never hearing the latch catch. Abigail, for her part, did not speak of the letter to anyone. She was seen walking the gravel path to her mailbox each morning, the sleeves of her coat pulled over her hands against the November wind, but there were no further deliveries from the past. Her quietness only made the curiosity grow, because in a place like Harrow County, silence was rarely interpreted as ignorance. It was a choice, one that often meant the truth was stranger than anyone dared to guess. At night, as the town's single streetlight cast its pale halo over the square, the conversations about the letter continued in kitchens and on porches. Some felt a shiver of superstition, others considered it a puzzle worth solving. But beneath every discussion, there was an unspoken understanding that Harrow County's history had always been porous. The past had a way of stepping into the present here, uninvited, and sometimes, unexplainable. And though no one could say it aloud without sounding foolish, more than a few people found themselves glancing toward the darkened road out of town, half expecting to see a figure in old-fashioned dress making her way toward the post office, carrying yet another letter whose time had not yet come. The name, Eliza Harrow, sat in the top left corner of the envelope like an inked whisper from another century. In the looping, deliberate cursive, each letter was formed with the care of someone who knew their words might be read only once, and wanted them to be remembered. The name was not common, not the sort that could be brushed aside as coincidence. It was a name tied to a particular time and place, one that, in Harrow County, came with shadows attached. Abigail Rowan had heard the name before. Not from her parents, they had been careful about the stories they told their children, but from her grandmother, whose memory in her later years had slipped its boundaries and wandered freely between decades. In those drifting recollections, Eliza Harrow was always young, always described in tones that mixed admiration with something more cautious. A beauty, yes, but a restless one. And always, the telling of her name ended with a pause, as if the story itself had taken something from the teller. Eliza had been 21 in the autumn of 1915, the youngest daughter of the Harrow family, whose estate had dominated the northern edge of the county. By all accounts, she was not the sort to be content with the quiet routines expected of her. She read newspapers from New York, corresponded with friends in London, and had been seen walking alone along the river path at hours that made neighbors frown. In a place where the measure of a young woman's life was in Sunday dresses and church attendance, Eliza's world seemed far too large for Harrow County's narrow lanes. And then, one October afternoon, she vanished. The official record, what little of it exists, is a single paragraph in the Harrow County Gazette. Miss Eliza Harrow was last seen departing the Harrow estate in a blue motorcar bound for town. She did not arrive. Residents with any knowledge are urged to contact the sheriff's office. That was all. No public search was recorded, no photographs were printed. Her absence was swallowed almost immediately by silence, as if the county had agreed, without speaking, to let her memory sink. Yet in whispers, the kind traded on back porches and in the corner booths of garrisons, there were other details. That Eliza had been seen mailing a letter that very day, slipping it into the postbox outside the depot with a look on her face that was neither fear nor joy, but something harder to name. That she had been overheard telling the postmaster it must arrive exactly as I've written it, and that the man had nodded, puzzled, as she walked away. No one knew to whom the letter was addressed. No one, until now. Abigail's hands tightened around the envelope as she sat at her kitchen table that night, the single lamp casting its amber pool of light. She traced the letters of Eliza's name with her fingertip, feeling the slight raised texture where the ink had bitten into the paper fibers. It was not just a relic, it was a presence, as if Eliza herself had reached across the years and placed this in her keeping. She thought of her grandmother again, of the way she had once said, "Some names don't just belong to people, they belong to the land." At the time, Abigail had dismissed it as one of those rural sayings that sounded wiser than it was. But now, with Eliza Harrow's name in her hands, she understood. In town, the older residents who remembered the Harrow estate spoke in half-sentences about Eliza. Mrs. May Carter recalled her mother warning her never to wander near the Walnut Line Drive. Ezra Boyd, who had been a boy of 10 in 1915, remembered a single Sunday when the Harrow pews sat empty and the pastor's sermon was about God's clock not being ours to read. No one mentioned a funeral. The Harrow estate itself had been sold in pieces after the disappearance. The great house was left to rot for decades, its windows black, the front doors chained. When it was finally torn down, workmen claimed to have found scraps of old correspondence in a locked writing desk, but the contents were never made public. Some said the letters were burned. Others said they were kept in a private collection, waiting for the right buyer. All of it, Abigail realized, converged on the single truth that Eliza Harrow had not merely gone missing, she had been erased. And now, 56 years after the postmark on this envelope, her name had surfaced again, handwritten in her own delicate hand, carrying a message that had somehow crossed a gulf of time no post office in the world could account for. That night, as rain streaked the window glass, Abigail set the envelope beside her teacup, the return name facing up. She could not bring herself to open it yet. Something told her that once she read the words inside, there would be no turning back, that the act itself would pull her into whatever current had carried this letter forward through decades. In the stillness, she thought she heard a faint rustle, as though paper were shifting in a drawer that had not been touched in years. Somewhere deep inside her, she suspected the story of Eliza Harrow was not finished. And for reasons she could not yet name, she also suspected that she, Abigail Rowan, born long after Eliza vanished, had been chosen to hear the rest. October of 1915 in Harrow County was a season caught between two worlds. The last of the summer heat still clung to the afternoons, but the mornings brought a chill that hinted at winter. The town square bustled with wagons, the air carrying the mingled smells of wood smoke, horses, and the faint sweetness of sorghum syrup boiling in iron kettles. Life moved to a rhythm dictated by the church bell and the harvest. Beyond the square, the Harrow estate loomed over the bend in the river like a stubborn relic of another century. Built of pale brick imported from Savannah, it had wide verandas and tall windows that reflected the late autumn sun. Black walnut trees lined the long drive, their leaves drifting down like sheets of gold. For decades, the Harrow name had been spoken with a mixture of admiration and quiet unease. They were not outsiders, their wealth was born of the same soil as the townspeople, but they seemed apart, holding to their own customs and confidences. Inside that house, Eliza Harrow's world was both privileged and confined. She slept beneath a canopy bed her great-grandmother had brought over from England, read books from the family library by lamplight, and practiced the piano under the watchful eye of a governess. But she also listened to the wireless, kept clippings from national newspapers, and wrote long letters to friends in cities she had never seen. She was curious in a way the county did not quite approve of, not rebellious enough to be scandalous, but far too restless to be invisible. The war in Europe was already casting its shadow across the American consciousness. Though the United States had not yet entered the conflict, the papers were full of casualty counts and photographs of ruined villages. In Harrow County, such matters felt impossibly far away, and yet, for Eliza, they were very near. Her elder brother, Charles, had sailed to France as a volunteer ambulance driver, and his letters spoke of things she could not unsee once she read them. She began to talk, cautiously at first, about the smallness of the county and the wider world beyond it. On the morning of October 12, she dressed in a deep blue walking suit and placed a sealed envelope into her handbag. The staff remembered her eating only a few bites of toast before announcing she would be going into town. The motor car she used, a modest model her father had purchased the year before, was seen by a farmhand turning onto the main road just before noon. After that, no one in Harrow County could claim to have seen her again. The search, such as it was, lasted barely a week. The sheriff, an aging man with a heavy limp, reported that there was no sign of foul play and suggested she had gone to join relatives in Savannah or Augusta. But those who knew her best rejected that explanation. Eliza had made no arrangements for travel. No luggage was missing from her room. And her family, so precise about every other detail of their lives, seemed strangely willing to accept her absence without challenge. In the years that followed, stories gathered around her name like leaves around the base of a fence. Some said she had run off with a soldier bound for Europe. Others claimed she had been seen walking along the riverbank in the fog, vanishing as the mist rose. The most persistent rumor was about the letter she had mailed that day, a letter no one could prove existed, but which older residents swore had been handed over the post office counter with particular instructions. No one could say who the letter was for, or whether it had ever been delivered. The records from that day were lost in a fire that gutted the depot office in the 1930s, leaving only gaps where certainty should have been. Yet the idea persisted, that somewhere in the county, or perhaps far beyond it, there was a message from Eliza Harrow traveling toward its destination, a destination that, for reasons no one could explain, had not yet been reached. And now, in 2025, a century and a decade after her disappearance, one such letter had arrived. Addressed not to a friend or family member from her own time, but to a woman who had been born long after she was gone. The past in Harrow County had never been a closed book. It lingered in the old roads that curved without reason, in the half-remembered tales passed down at kitchen tables. But with the arrival of that letter, the boundary between then and now seemed thinner than ever. It was as though some unfinished business from the autumn of 1915 had finally, impossibly, found its way forward. The envelope sat on Abigail Rowan's kitchen table for 3 days before she dared to open it. In that time, it seemed to develop a presence of its own. No matter where she moved it, to the sideboard, to a drawer, even under a stack of bills, her eyes found it. Its weight was small, but the pull it exerted on her thoughts was relentless. On the 4th evening, the November sky outside had darkened to the color of wet slate. The wind rattled the bare limbs of the pecan trees in the yard, and the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway filled the silences between her breaths. She lit a single lamp, poured herself a cup of tea she would never drink, and sat down before the envelope. Her fingers hesitated at the seal. The paper felt fragile, as if too much pressure might tear it apart. She slid a butter knife carefully under the flap, hearing the faint crackle as glue gave way, glue that had held for more than a century. The scent that rose from the opening was faint but distinct, old paper, a whisper of lavender, and something sharper, like iron or rain-soaked stone. Inside was a single folded sheet of cream-colored stationery. The ink was brown with age, but the handwriting was steady and graceful, each letter leaning into the next as though pulled forward by urgency. At the top, in elegant script, was the date, October 12, 1915. The salutation made Abigail's stomach tighten. "My dearest Abigail," it began. She read it again, certain she had misread. But the name was there, plain as day. Eliza Harrow, writing to a woman who would not be born for another 57 years. The letter itself was not long, but each sentence seemed to sink deeper than the one before. Eliza wrote of a journey that will not be believed, of a night when the river runs black with memory, and of the danger of closing one's eyes when the hour comes. She mentioned events, a fire in the schoolhouse, a flood that would carry away the West Bridge, that Abigail knew had happened decades after 1915. One line in particular stopped her cold: "You will know me not by my face, but by the sound of my step upon the porch, and by the way the wind will shift when I arrive." Abigail's tea had gone cold, her hands slick with sweat. The letter ended without signature, the final words trailing into a flourish that looked less like a name and more like a mark. She laid the paper flat on the table and stared at it, her mind racing between possibilities. Could it be a hoax? If so, it was a masterful one. The ink's age, the paper's texture, even the watermark in the corner that read, "Whitmore Sons, 1912, were perfectly consistent. And yet, no hoax could explain how her name appeared in a letter dated before her parents were born. She rose and checked the locks on the doors, though she couldn't have said why. As she moved from room to room, the old floorboards creaked in familiar patterns, until one step on the front porch sounded different. Sharper. Hollow. Abigail froze, every nerve on edge. The wind outside shifted abruptly, carrying the scent of damp earth into the room. She turned toward the window, but saw only darkness beyond the glass. When she returned to the table, the letter lay exactly where she had left it, but the butter knife was gone. By the following morning, Abigail's resolve had shifted from private dread to a quiet, methodical need for answers. She wrapped the letter in brown paper, slid it into a rigid mailer, and drove into town to see the one man she trusted with delicate matters, Harold Pritchard, the retired postmaster. Pritchard's office was no longer official, it was a converted back room of his home, where shelves of postal history books leaned against walls lined with glass cases. Inside those cases were stamps older than the county itself, rare postmarks from closed routes, and the gleaming brass scales he had once used behind the counter. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old glue. When Abigail set the envelope on his desk, he adjusted his glasses and studied it in silence. He did not touch it at first. Instead, he leaned closer, as though proximity alone might reveal its secrets. "This is extraordinary," he said finally, his voice low. You don't see edging like that on envelopes after the 20s. And this, he pointed to the faint, uneven inking of the postmark, this is a strike from a Model D canceling machine. They stopped using those in 1920. He donned cotton gloves and lifted the envelope gently, tilting it toward the light. Paper stock feels right. Weight is correct. And this stamp, he tapped the corner with one gloved finger. This was issued in 1913. They only printed a small run. Nearly all of them were sold out by 15. Abigail waited. Could someone fake that? Pritchard frowned. With enough time and skill? Possibly. But I'd wager my pension this is genuine. At least the envelope and stamp are. When he slid the letter out, he held it just long enough to examine the watermark. Whitmore Sons, he murmured. Stationers in Savannah. Closed in 21. Abigail watched as he studied the handwriting. Slant is consistent with early 20th century cursive instruction. No signs of modern ballpoint pressure, fountain pen, most likely. Ink's oxidized in a way you can't fake without decades of exposure. She hesitated before speaking the part that had kept her awake the night before. It's addressed to me. By name. Pritchard's eyes flicked up to hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he carefully slid the letter back into the envelope, folded the gloves onto the desk, and sat back. You understand this is irregular. Impossible, Abigail corrected. That too. She left with the letter wrapped tightly again, but Pritchard's words followed her home. If I were you, I'd keep it somewhere safe. Somewhere only you know about. That night, she placed the envelope inside a cedar box her grandmother had once kept sewing notions in. She set the box on the highest shelf in her bedroom closet, beneath folded quilts that smelled faintly of camphor. It might have ended there, had it not been for the story that began to circulate by the end of the week. An elderly man at the feed store claimed that in 1974, his late wife had received a letter postmarked 1916. It had been addressed to her grandfather, who had died as a young man. The contents had been brief, a warning to stay inside on the night of the river's turning. She'd kept it hidden for years, he said, before it vanished without explanation. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Abigail returned to Pritchard, but he had little more to add, except for one quiet admission. I've seen maybe 2 or 3 like this in my lifetime. Always from around that same era. Always to someone who wasn't meant to be alive when it was written. And then, almost as an afterthought, every one of those letters had the same return name. Eliza Harrow. By the time a week had passed, the letter was no longer just Abigail's secret. It had become the town's quiet obsession. Harrow County had a way of carrying stories in whispers, and this one moved with particular speed. Even those who claimed not to believe in such things found themselves asking careful questions, their voices pitched low, as if a louder tone might wake something they'd rather keep sleeping. Most of the talk gathered in the back room of Garrison's general store, a narrow space lined with shelves of feed sacks and dusty jars. It was here, under the faint glow of a single hanging bulb, that the most persistent minds, and tongues, in the county came to weigh what they knew. I'm telling you, it's a trick of the post, said Ned Clark, a man who had worked half his life on the freight line. You get letters stuck in the wrong bin, sometimes for years. Seen it myself. Could be it sat in some depot 100 miles from here until someone finally noticed. That would be fine, Mrs. May Carter replied, her hands folded neatly in her lap, if it didn't have that girl's name on it. And if the words inside didn't talk about things that hadn't happened yet. She spoke the last part softly, but her gaze was steady. A young mechanic named Lowell leaned forward on his elbows. Could be somebody's idea of a joke. Folks collect old stamps, old paper, easy enough to put together. Might be she's being toyed with. Harold Pritchard shook his head from his corner seat. No joke. The seal on that envelope had never been broken until she opened it. I'd stake my reputation on it. There was a pause then the kind that happens when disbelief meets a fact it can't quite bend. Into that silence, Pastor John Avery spoke. He was a tall man, his voice deep and careful, like a bell tolling across water. "Not everything is meant to be pulled into the light," he said. "The good book warns against troubling the boundaries between the living and the dead. Sometimes the Lord sends a message forward, and sometimes it's the other way around. Either way, it comes at a cost." "That's just it," May said, almost to herself. "If Eliza Harrow's sending letters, what is she paying? And what is she buying?" The room grew still. Abigail didn't attend these gatherings, but she heard the summaries. In the market, over the phone, through the gaps in conversation when someone didn't realize she had entered the room. She could feel the town drawing lines, believers on one side, skeptics on the other, with her standing somewhere uncomfortably in between. At home, she began to notice things. The creak of the porch boards when no one was there. The sudden shift of wind through the pecan trees, bending their bare limbs eastward when the forecast called for calm. Once, while boiling water for tea, she glanced toward the cedar box in her closet and saw, for the briefest moment, a single fold of white peeking from under the lid, though she had locked it. When she tried to explain these things to herself, the rational part of her mind offered solutions. Wood expands in cold weather, wind can rise without warning. But the other part, the part that had read her own name in a letter dated 1915, could not shake the feeling that the message was not the end, but the beginning. That same week, an unfamiliar man arrived in town. He introduced himself as Dr. Leonard Price, historian from the State University. He had heard, somehow, about an unusual postal artifact and asked Abigail for permission to examine it. His questions were meticulous: the dimensions of the envelope, the consistency of the ink, the pressure of the pen strokes. But when she asked if he believed it possible for a letter to move forward in time, his answer was neither yes nor no. "I believe," he said, "that sometimes the world bends in ways we do not have the language for. And when that happens, it leaves behind traces. Objects. Messages." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "What matters most is not how it happened, but why you received it." The why hung over her like a shadow. That night, Abigail sat by the kitchen window long after the lamps were out. The moon was thin, the kind of pale crescent that looked sharp enough to cut. Somewhere down the road, a fox barked once, then fell silent. And in that silence, she found herself wondering which was worse, that the letter was a hoax crafted by human hands, or that it was not a hoax at all. The first to offer a purely practical explanation was Dr. Leonard Price. He returned to Abigail's house 2 days later carrying a slim leather case filled with tools, a magnifying loupe, a portable ultraviolet lamp, even a small kit for testing ink composition. He worked in silence at her kitchen table, the cedar box open between them, the letter laid out as gently as a patient under a surgeon's hand. Under the UV lamp, the paper revealed faint tide lines, water damage at some point in its history. Price traced them with a gloved fingertip. "Could have been stuck in an old depot basement," he said. "Flooded once, dried out, and forgotten." Abigail nodded, though she remembered the smell when she had first opened it, lavender and iron, not mildew. Price moved on to the ink. "Fountain pen, yes. Iron gall formula, common until about the 1930s. Matches the period." He glanced up at her. "And that's the problem. Everything matches. A perfect alignment of materials, methods, and condition. Too perfect. How can it be too perfect? Because an object kept in the open air for 100 years always carries more damage than this. Even in a sealed space, you'd expect more yellowing. This looks preserved." When he left that afternoon, he offered no final opinion, only the vague reassurance of a man who knew more than he was willing to say. Other voices weighed in as the story spread beyond the county line. An amateur postal historian from Atlanta wrote to Abigail suggesting the letter could have been trapped for decades inside the internal mechanisms of an old sorting machine, only to be dislodged when the machine was refurbished. But Abigail found herself circling back to the detail that refused to bend, her name, written plainly at the top of the page, in 1915. No sorting error could account for that. Even Pritchard, who clung to his measured skepticism, admitted that postal machinery didn't explain the predictions inside the letter, the fire in the schoolhouse, the flood that washed out the West Bridge. Both events had occurred within Abigail's lifetime. When she mentioned this to Pastor Avery, his expression was grim. "You can keep looking for a worldly cause," he said, "but some messages aren't meant to be solved that way. They're sent to prepare, not to explain." That word, prepare, lodged in her mind like a splinter. Prepare for what? In the days that followed, her dreams began to change. They were not chaotic fragments, but coherent scenes, vivid in color and sound. In one, she stood on the front porch of the old Harrow estate, the walnut trees lining the drive heavy with yellowing leaves. She could hear someone approaching, but their steps were muffled, as though coming from a long distance. In another, she stood at the edge of the river in thick fog, listening to the slow lap of water against stone. Somewhere in the mist, a woman's voice called her name, the same voice she imagined might have spoken it as it was written. She told herself they were dreams, nothing more, but they carried the same weight as the waking moments when the wind shifted without warning or the porch creaked under invisible footsteps. The letter, it seemed, had opened a kind of channel, not only between past and present, but between her waking and sleeping hours. Dr. Price sent one final note before disappearing back into his academic world. It was short, written in careful script: "Your letter has no provenance, yet it also has no break in provenance. This is paradox. Be cautious." It was not the kind of caution that made her want to lock the letter away again. It was the kind that made her want to keep it closer than ever. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, slid into her mailbox between an electric bill and a seed catalog. Abigail almost didn't notice it at first. The envelope was smaller than the first, its paper the same pale cream, its edges softened with age. But when she turned it over, she felt the breath leave her chest. The return name was the same, Eliza Harrow. The postmark, like before, was from Harrow County, but dated April 3, 1916. This time, the addressee was not Abigail. It was addressed in the same flowing hand to Mr. Thomas L. Weatherby, Harrow County, Georgia. The name meant nothing to her at first, but a quick search through an old county directory unearthed it. Thomas Weatherby had died in 1962. He'd been a farmer, a veteran, a man with no known connection to the Harrow family. And yet, when Abigail slit the seal and unfolded the page inside, she saw her own name again. "My dearest Abigail," it began, exactly as before. The tone was different this time. The words had an urgency that felt almost fevered. Eliza spoke of threads tightening and the shadow at the bend in the river. She referred to Thomas Weatherby not as if he were a stranger, but as if he were a link in a chain, a custodian of some knowledge, witness in waiting, whose time had come and gone. There was a reference to the first messenger, and the keeper who does not know she keeps. Abigail read it twice, her pulse quickening. This was not random. Someone, or something, was choosing these recipients with purpose. The first letter had found her directly, the second had been sent to a man long dead but contained words clearly meant for her eyes. She carried it to Pritchard, who read the name aloud and frowned deeply. Thomas Weatherby. I knew his son. Good man. Never heard a word about anything like this. Could it be another in that handful you've seen? She asked. He shook his head slowly. Those others, they were scattered. Years between them. Different counties, even. This one's different. It came straight to your box. As if, he trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. In town, the arrival of the second letter stirred the undercurrent of speculation into something stronger. Believers saw it as proof of design. Skeptics muttered about hoaxes growing more elaborate. But a few, the ones who remembered the Harrow name with that old unease, began to avoid Abigail altogether, as if proximity to her might draw them into whatever was unfolding. That night, she placed the two letters side by side on her kitchen table. They looked harmless enough, paper, ink, the faint emboss of postmarks nearly erased by time. But together, they formed a pattern that suggested there would be more. And she couldn't decide which unsettled her more, the thought that the letters would stop, leaving her stranded in uncertainty, or the thought that they would continue until some hidden design was complete. The two letters lay in a neat diagonal on Abigail's kitchen table like coordinates on a map she did not know how to read. She had stopped pretending she could go about her days as though nothing had changed. The lesson plan stacked on her desk at the school went unmarked. The radio, once a quiet companion in the evenings, stayed silent. She moved through rooms with the careful gait of someone avoiding invisible tripwires. On the third night after the second letter arrived, she woke to the smell of damp stone and river silt, a scent so vivid it pulled her from sleep as surely as a hand on her shoulder. She sat up, listening. The house was quiet. Yet somewhere, not far, she could hear the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps crossing a wooden surface. 1, 2, 3, and then stillness. Her porch again. The same tread the letter had promised. She rose and opened the front door onto a windless dark. The boards beneath her feet were cold. The pecan trees stood motionless, their branches etched against the thin moon like veins. Nothing moved in the yard, the gravel path was a pale ribbon leading to the road. She waited, breath shallow, until the chill reached her bones, and then she closed the door and locked it twice. By morning, her resolve had shifted from patience to hunger. She called in sick to the school with a voice steady enough to convince the secretary, then drove to the county archives downtown, a brick building that smelled of dust and lemon oil, where the librarian, Miss Henley, guarded her vault of papers like a dragon atop gold. Abigail signed the logbook and descended into the records room, where wooden drawers held slips of 1,000 untidy lives. Family? Miss Henley asked from the doorway, her expression neutral but curious. History, Abigail answered. Harrow. A slight pause, then a nod. Index drawers are along the far wall. You'll want the property records, ledgers, and the Gazette on microfilm. She watched Abigail for a beat longer. You're not the first to ask. Just the first in some time. The names and numbers swimmed at first, deeds, mortgages, tax liens, the legal settlement of a vanishing estate. But beneath the arithmetic, patterns emerged. Transfers of land to shell families no one recognized. A sudden cessation of legal activity in late 1915, as if a quill had been lifted mid-sentence and never set down again. In the Gazette, she found the short piece she had already heard quoted, Miss Eliza Harrow, last seen, bound for town. No follow-up. No plea from the family. Only a small advertisement 3 weeks later for an estate sale of assorted household goods, including writing desks and a pianoforte, placed by a firm in Savannah. She copied names into a notebook, drawing arrows between them like makeshift constellations. Weatherby appeared once, in 1939, a farm boundary dispute settled in his favor near the river bend. She circled it. The river again. The bend again. Threads tightening, Eliza had written. By afternoon, the fluorescent lights buzzed and her eyes burned. She pushed away from the microfilm reader and rubbed her temples. Miss Henley appeared with a glass of water, her gaze softening. You should rest, she said. Harrow County will still be here when you come back. I can't, Abigail answered, surprised at the confession. I don't sleep. When I do, I wake to hear things. Miss Henley considered this, then lowered her voice. Your grandmother used to sit where you're sitting. Years ago. She wasn't looking for Harrow then, she was looking for a bridge. Said the county had a way of losing what it wanted to forget. She told me once that remembering is its own kind of courage. A pause. Don't let the county put its forgetting on you. Driving home, the sky had clouded to a uniform pewter and the fields lay flat and patient under the weight of it. She thought of her grandmother's cedar box, of the quilts that smelled of camphor, of the way the letters had altered the air of her house just by existing. It felt like a pressure system had settled over her life, the kind that never showed up on a map but could be felt in the soft tissue around the eyes and in the sharpness of the breath. That evening, the phone rang. It was Pastor Avery. "I've been praying on your situation," he said without preamble. "There are matters better addressed in prayer than in paper." "And if the papers are what call for the prayers?" she asked. "Then we pray while we burn the papers," he replied, not unkindly. She stared at the 2 envelopes on the table, the old stamps like small, faded eyes. "I'm not ready to do that." "Then at least bring them to the church," he said. "Let the Lord hold them with you." She did not answer. After a moment, the pastor sighed, and his tone softened. "Be careful, Abigail. Proximity has a cost." She hung up and turned the radio to a low hum, not to listen but to fill the silence with something human-made. The house, in response, grew quieter, as if listening back. The next day brought the first cracks with the living. At school, a parent cornered her by the office door, her smile too tight. "My Emma says you told the class a story about a ghost letter." Abigail hadn't. She had said nothing to her students. But the rumor had found its target anyway. Another parent withdrew a child until the situation resolves. The principal, apologetic but formal, suggested a leave of absence to manage personal matters. She drove home with her jaw clenched and her hands numb on the wheel. It wasn't just that the town was turning away, it was the sense that it had been waiting for an excuse, as if the old unease around the Harrow name had needed only a host to inhabit. By the time she reached her driveway, she was shaking. Inside, she set water to boil and stared at the kettle as if furious patience might force it to whistle faster. When it finally did, she poured, then left the cup untouched on the counter. She opened the cedar box and took out the letters, laying them flat on the table without their envelopes for the first time. The handwriting was as calm as a pulse taken at rest. She traced the flourishes with a fingertip, the paper cool beneath her skin. "Why me?" she said into the empty room. "Why now?" As if answering, a scrap of sound rose from the porch, a single footfall, then another, then the faintest brush of fabric. It was unmistakable this time. She stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor, and she crossed the room in 3 long steps, pulling open the door. The porch was empty, but a small object lay on the top step, her grandmother's butter knife, the one that had vanished the night she opened the first letter. Its handle, worn smooth by years of use, caught the dim light and held it like a memory. She picked it up, heartbeat thundering. The blade was clean. No fingerprints but hers. The phone rang again. It was Pritchard. "I don't mean to alarm you," he said, and the tremor in his voice ensured that he did, but a man came asking after the letters. "Not a local. Said he'd heard about a temporal correspondence artifact and used your name without hesitation. I told him nothing, but I do not like the look of this." "Did he give a name?" "Price," Pritchard said, and Abigail's breath hitched. "Dr. Leonard Price. Though he didn't sound like a man merely curious, Miss Rowan. He sounded like a man checking on the progress of a shipment." After they hung up, she sat with the butter knife folded in her lap and the letters on the table before her. The house felt suddenly too small for what it contained. She rose, fetched a roll of brown paper and twine, and wrapped the letters into a neat bundle. Then she pulled down the attic ladder and climbed into the low, dust-scented space under the rafters, where the light fell in a thin, slanted bar through a single vent. She searched along the beams until she found a gap where a knot had fallen from the wood, leaving a small hollow. She tucked the bundle into it, pushed a scrap of rafter dust over the opening, and lowered the ladder behind her, her hands blackened with old pine. When she stepped back into the kitchen, the kettle had cooled and a ring of tea stained the counter where the cup had stood too long. She cleaned it with a rag that smelled faintly of starch. The ordinary motion steadied her for half a minute. And then the doorbell rang. Once, then twice, then, after a pause, a third time, a patient sequence, as if following an agreed-upon code. Abigail stood in the doorway between kitchen and hall, unable to move. She thought of the pastor's warning, of the way the town's eyes slid away from hers now, of the careful lines she had drawn between sleep and waking that the letters had blurred. She thought, finally, of the single sentence that had lodged in her like a thorn, "You will know me by my step upon the porch." The bell did not ring again. Instead, the wind shifted, a subtle rearrangement of air that moved through the house like a sigh, lifting a curl of paper on the table and setting it down again. Outside, the pecan tree's lowest branch creaked once, twice, though the leaves were still. Something in her gave way. She walked to the door and set her hand on the knob, not turning it yet, only feeling the cool metal against her skin. She understood, then, that whatever boundary had once stood between her life and the thing pressing against it had thinned to a membrane. Another letter would come or it would not. Another step would sound or it would not. But the cost of waiting without answers had already been paid in full. The night after the doorbell, Abigail barely slept. She lay in bed listening for footsteps, for the creak of the porch, for any shift in the wind that might carry an answer. By morning, her body ached from stillness. The house felt heavier somehow, its walls holding in a tension she could almost taste. It was just after 2 in the afternoon when it came. No knock. No bell. No sound of gravel crunching underfoot. She only noticed because the air in the front hall seemed subtly disturbed, as if a door had been opened and closed without her hearing it. On the floor just inside the front door lay an envelope. No postage, no postmark. Its pale paper was identical to the others, but this time the handwriting was different, not in style, but in strength. The letters trembled, as if written in haste or with a hand unsteady from age or exhaustion. The return name was still Eliza Harrow. Abigail crouched to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the cool wood of the floorboards. She turned it over. The flap was not sealed, it had been tucked in only loosely, as if meant to be opened quickly. She carried it to the kitchen table and unfolded the single sheet inside. The letter began without salutation. The words tumbled across the page in long, breathless lines. I do not have long. The others will not understand why I am doing this. The threads are almost drawn closed. When you read this, I will already be gone again. There was a strange cadence to the sentences, as though Eliza had been writing while listening for something, pausing, starting again, doubling back to cross out a word before continuing. She mentioned the crossing, and the keeper who is not yet born, and a place she called the Bend in the Black Water, a place Abigail knew from childhood walks by the river, though no one called it that anymore. Halfway down the page, the ink darkened, blotting where the nib had lingered too long. The handwriting shifted, the loops wider, the strokes sharper. Do not look for me at the house. It is not mine anymore. If you hear the step, open the door before it stops. If you wait until it stops, you will never see me. The letter ended mid-sentence. A long dash trailed off into empty space, the pen clearly lifted in a hurry. Abigail read it 3 times, each time feeling the same tightening in her chest. The absence of a date unnerved her most, until she noticed, in the upper right corner, a faint pencil mark. It was written in a hand that did not match Eliza's, April 17, 2026. A date almost a full year in the future. Her first impulse was to take it to Pritchard. But something in the letter's urgency made her hold it back. Instead, she placed it beside the other 2 and studied them together. The first had been calm, almost formal. The second had carried a warning. This one was raw, pressing against the edge of panic. She spent the rest of the afternoon in restless motion, pacing, checking the windows, walking the length of the porch, scanning the road beyond the pecan trees. As the sun lowered, the wind shifted again, just as it had the night she opened the first letter. It brought with it the faint scent of river water and wood smoke. At dusk, she left the porch light off and sat by the window, the new letter in her lap. She could feel the moment before it happened, that subtle thinning of the air, the almost silence just before a sound becomes audible. Then, one footstep. Another. The boards creaked in the slow, deliberate rhythm she had been promised she would know. Her hand closed around the doorknob. She didn't wait for the steps to stop. Abigail never told anyone what she saw when she opened the door that night. The neighbors would later remember only that her porch light was off, that her silhouette stood framed in the doorway for what seemed like a long time, and that the wind rose sharply just as she stepped outside. But beyond that, the night left no record in the official sense, no photographs, no witnesses willing to swear to more than shadows and sound. By morning, the letters were gone. She awoke on the sofa, the lamplight still burning, her coat draped over her knees as if she had lain down for only a moment. The cedar box was open in the bedroom, its quilts folded neatly back into place, the hollow in the attic rafter empty. On the kitchen table sat the butter knife once more, its handle gleaming faintly in the pale light of dawn. She searched the house twice, then a third time, every room, every drawer. Nothing. The paper, the envelopes, even the brown wrapping from Pritchard's examination, all gone. When she drove into town to tell him, the postmaster's small back office felt suddenly too cramped for the weight of the story. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded, his eyes narrowing only when she described the future date in the corner of the third letter. "That's the part one can't account for," he said finally. "Even if someone managed every other detail, the postmarks, the handwriting, the ink, that date changes the nature of the thing. It means whoever wrote it wasn't looking backward." He hesitated, then added, "It means they were looking at you." Within a week, the first rumors began. Some said she had burned the letters herself out of fear. Others claimed a government man had come to collect them, though no one agreed on his name or agency. One story had her sending them back through the post to some unlisted address, as if returning borrowed property. Abigail stayed home for the rest of the winter, her leave from the school becoming permanent without any formal notice. She avoided the square, avoided the church, avoided anything that might pull her into a conversation about the Harrow name. It was early spring when a county records clerk named Alan Boone visited her unannounced. He carried a cloth-bound ledger from 1915, found while cataloging old storage boxes from the courthouse basement. "I thought you should see this," he said, laying it on her table. The ledger was a postal ledger, thin, precise lines of entries listing outgoing mail. In October of that year, 3 entries were marked in the same neat hand, held by request, E.H. No address. No delivery record. No notation of retrieval. Just the same initials beside each date. Eliza Harrow. Alan shook his head. There's no procedure for, held by request, back then. If something wasn't deliverable, it went to dead mail in Savannah. And yet here it is, in black and white. 3 letters. Abigail closed the ledger slowly. "If those 3 are the ones I had, then one's still missing," Alan finished. In the years that followed, the absence of the letters became a presence of its own. People spoke of them as if they were still somewhere in the county, waiting. Some claimed to have seen Abigail walking the road by the river at dusk, looking down as if searching for something in the gravel. Others said she had moved away, leaving the house to sit empty, the porch sagging a little more each year. No one agreed on the details, but everyone agreed the story had changed them. For some, it was a reminder of the strange elasticity of time in a place like Harrow County, where the past could step forward without warning. For others, it was a caution, proof that certain doors, once opened, could not be closed without a cost. 2 decades later, a graduate student researching rural postal routes of the early 20th century stumbled across a reference to temporal correspondence in a privately published history of the state. The entry was only a paragraph, but it described a sequence of letters from a woman in 1915 to recipients decades later. No names, no locations, only the curious detail that the final letter in the sequence was undelivered, its intended recipient not yet arrived. The student tracked the source to an elderly man in Augusta who refused to speak about it directly. But when pressed, he offered a single sentence: some messages refuse to be bound by time. Back in Harrow County, the story of Eliza Harrow still circulates, though in a form smoothed and altered by retelling. Children dare each other to walk the bend in the river after dark, to listen for footsteps on the porch of the old Rowan place. The older generation simply lowers their voices when the Harrow name comes up, as if the act of speaking it might draw the wind from the wrong direction. And somewhere, in a locked cabinet in the farthest corner of the county's abandoned postal substation, there is said to be a drawer without a label. The drawer sticks when pulled, as if resisting, but inside are 3 thin envelopes, their paper cool and dry as if they had been placed there yesterday. On the return corner of each, in fine, slanted cursive, is written the same name, Eliza Harrow. The dates are strange. One reads October 12, 1915. Another, April 3, 1916. The third is marked April 17, 2026. No one can say how long they have been there, and no one, not even the clerks who claim to have seen them, will touch them with bare hands. Because the story has outlived the woman who received the letters, and the woman who wrote them. And it will outlive the rest of Harrow County, too, if the drawers in the dead mail office are never emptied. In the end, the legacy of the letters is not their content, or even their impossibility. It is the quiet they leave behind, the pause in a voice before speaking, the glance over a shoulder on an empty road, the way a person stands a moment too long at their own front door before stepping inside. It is the understanding that the post between worlds, once opened, is never truly closed.